Heavenly Father, we're just so thankful that even though the temperatures are cold, even though there's a virus out there, we're here and we're able to just come together to study your word. I pray that as we begin this study in Revelation, that you give us wisdom and understanding. Help us to be charitable to maybe alternative views that maybe we haven't heard before. But ultimately, we just pray that you'd be honored and glorified. And we praise in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So everybody should have a book. It is the Book of Revelation by Dr. Mark Hitchcock is the name of it. So if you took angelology with me in the fall, that was an original work that I put together. Revelation is not. The reason why is because I think this guy did a good job, and I don't think I can improve on it, so we're going to go with his stuff. Dr. Mark Hitchcock, he teaches at Dallas Theological Seminary. He's written close to 30 books on Revelation alone. He is a full-time pastor who preaches through this. And back in, 2015, he was putting together this course, and I actually helped fund the production of this course. And I have been through this personally sitting under him. I have taught this in a small group, and so this is the third time, so it should be better, right? Third time's a charm. So I'm excited to go through this. You will notice as you open it up, in the contents, there are 27 sessions. We are not meeting for 27 weeks, all right? We have 12 weeks scheduled, which means the goal is on certain weeks we will get through 3 sessions, but most of the time it'll be about 2 sessions. I always tell my classes, if we end up needing to go to a 13th session, just because we get bogged down in conversation, I will take the time, because ultimately my desire is that when you come through this entire class, you'll say, hey, I have a good handle of the book of Revelation, so next time you're reading it in your daily Bible reading, you're like, hey, I remember that. You can kind of make some sense of everything that's going on, or you can at least go look at your notes and figure it out. So Revelation is a big book with a lot of content. So you'll want to make sure you bring this each week. It has the class notes in it, and they're pretty well laid out with lots of pictures. The other thing I want you to know, if you turn to page 16, at the end of every chapter, there is some questions. We're not going to do the questions in class unless we run out of time, and then I'll just start asking questions. We'll get some class discussion going. But my encouragement to you would be to go home after each week and work through that. I think it'll help you get more out of this class and really help you narrow down what you believe. Like, for instance, question number 1 under my beliefs about the millennium. And some of you are like, what's a millennium? Well, that's okay. You'll know after this morning. So lots of stuff to go through. But if you just want to come to class and listen and participate in some conversation, and you don't want to do the questions, that's fine too. But that's available to you. So let's go ahead and get started with Revelation, session 1. So there are 2 outlooks that generally people have in life. They either think that everything in the world is pointing towards a utopia, which is an imagined place, a state of things, which everything is perfect. How many of you ever watched Star Trek back in the 60s and the 80s and 90s, right? Yeah. They kind of paint this idea that Earth has become a utopia. There's no money, everyone speaks the same language, nobody has to work unless they want to, and then you just contribute to society. Everything's just, you just say to a computer, tea, Earl Grey, hot, and it just materializes out of nothing, right? The picture of utopia. Or people go the opposite direction and say, nope, we're heading towards an apocalypse, right? The complete final destruction of the world, especially as described in the book of Revelation. And there's, I feel though like as the world is getting more and more pessimistic and people are leaning more towards apocalypse. Think about it, right? What's everyone saying? The world's going to end from global warming or a viral outbreak, huh? And so people have been even more and more pessimistic over the last year. Just look at some of the headlines out there. This is a headline from 2020. Who predicted the end of the world in 2021? Was it Nostradamus or the Mayans? Well, both did is actually the answer. So will the world end later this year? I don't know. We'll find out. Remember Harold Camping? Yeah. He says the end of the world is probably October 21st, 2011. That was his second prediction. The first one, I think, was in 2010 or something like that. And we know how that turned out. That obviously didn't happen. How many of you know televangelist Jim Bakker? Ever heard of him? You know, he sells those 5-gallon buckets of tribulation food so you can make it through the tribulation period, right? So this was a review of somebody who bought it and tried it and reviewed it, like a food critic reviewed his survival food. It's barely food. That's what. Or how about this one? This is relevant. Is Kamala Harris the great whore of Revelation riding the power on the beast? How many of you have seen that speculation? Right? Because she was wearing all purple and, yeah. Spoiler alert, she's not. Or here's one that maybe hits a little bit closer to home. Some evangelicals fear the mark of the beast from coronavirus vaccine, talking about Bill Gates and the microchipping and all that kind of stuff, right? And I'll give you another spoiler. When we get to that, I will resoundingly tell you that no, that's not possible based on, so far, all the evidence. So, based on what the mark of the beast is. So sorry to, destroy your conspiracy theories this morning. Okay. So, it seems like since the Left Behind series, and how many are familiar with the Left Behind series? Okay, a lot of you are, right? Ever since then, it seems to be that people are really obsessed with Bible prophecy. And so here's some of the top 10 ways you know you're obsessed with it. You use the Left Behind books as devotional reading. You get goosebumps when you hear a trumpet. Oh, is this the call? Oh, we're going! You believe the term church fathers refers to Hal Lindsey and Tim LaHaye. They're the authors of the Left Behind books. So this one, I don't know. You have to have some old timers in here to understand this one, but I'll give it anyways. You believe there's an original Greek and Hebrew text with Schofield notes. Anyone familiar with Schofield? That's pretty old school. You can name more signs of the times than commandments. So all the signs of the things are coming, earthquakes and plague and war and rumors of war. You refuse a tax refund check because the amount comes to $666. That'll probably be the next stimulus check, $666. So. Barcode scanners make you nervous, right? Because you think, oh, that's the mark of the beast. I'm going to put a barcode on my hand or forehead. You talk your church into adopting the 60s pop song Up, Up, and Away as a Christian hymn. You never buy green bananas because you won't be around long enough for them to turn ripe. Christ is coming any moment now. You always leave the top down in your convertible or sunroof open in case the rapture happens. You don't want to get left behind because you can't get out of your car. Okay, so there's some fun this morning, but to get a little more serious, 30% of the Bible is prophetic when it was written. 30%. In other words, 30% of the Bible at the time it was written was talking about events that had not happened yet. That's a huge chunk. That means Old Testament and New Testament alike, right? Because even though we're going to be studying Revelation, do you realize, though, that Revelation doesn't really tell you anything new per se. It's just greater detail of things that were discussed in Ezekiel, in Daniel, and by Jesus himself in Matthew. And so it's just a little bit greater detail of those things, but prophetic writing nonetheless. The book of Revelation is a capstone of God's message to us. It helps us put the Bible together. This is important to realize because I think for a lot of Christians, they treat Revelation like they do Leviticus in the Old Testament. So when you're doing your annual Bible reading, you get to Leviticus, you're like, okay, I'm done. I can't handle it. And then you get the Revelation, it's like, okay, all this symbolic stuff, and you just kind of like, tune out, whatever the case is. But your understanding of Revelation is really dependent upon how well you understand the rest of the Bible. Because it's kind of like a good TV show, okay? So me and my family, we're watching WandaVision. Anyone else watching that right now? No one? Oh, man. Okay. Sorry. How many of you watched Lost back in the day? How about that? Okay, some of you. So do you remember back in Lost, like when you'd watch an episode, and then for the whole next week, everyone would talk about and all these theories and how it's all going to play together and so forth. And you probably know like a good TV show that you've done that with before, right? Well, it's kind of like that. Throughout the rest of the Bible, there'll be like these little hints of things that somebody will reference. And you're like, well, where's that going to go? What's going to happen there? Revelation is kind of like, you know, that series finale that just kind of brings all the answers that you want. But it has a much more satisfying ending than probably your TV shows, right? Because it ends with Christ coming back and a new heaven and a new earth and so forth. So that's how I view Revelation. It's a capstone of God's message to us. It's the series finale on a TV show that's been going on for 7,000 plus years. So where we're going, there are three things we're doing basically in the course outline for the whole class. There's going to be introduction. So today we're not going to get into like trumpets and seals and bowl judgments and stuff like that, but we're really going to talk about how do we approach this book as we read it, because your approach to it will really determine how you read it quite a bit. Then we're going to look at main issues and problem passages, and we're not going to hit every single little detail because that would take us probably more than 27 weeks. But we are going to hit all the main issues and all the problem passages, and you will have a good understanding and flow of the whole book when we're done. All right, so the title of the book. The title of the book is The Revelation of Jesus Christ. Okay? Here are some incorrect titles that we often call the book of Revelation. We call it Revelations. There is no S. There's a single revelation. There are not multiple of them. Okay? I can't tell you how many times that I hear Christians call it Revelations. In fact, I'm one of those Bible grammar Nazis, and I will correct you if I hear you say it, and then people get mad at me. So if I ever do that to you, I apologize ahead of time. Not really. Just kidding. But no, it is Revelation, not Revelations. It is not the revelation of St. John. Okay, this is not the Apostle John giving us a revelation. That is often how Roman Catholics refer to it. Or they'll refer to it as the revelation of St. John the Divine. Okay? He's not any more divine than any other Christian. So why call him that? And so the full title of the book is the Revelation of Jesus Christ. And so, but there is a question of how "of" is translated. Is it about Jesus Christ, or is it from Jesus Christ? And I really think the answer to that is a little bit of both, because it is absolutely about Jesus Christ coming and finally taking what is rightfully his. It is his coronation. He is becoming king in Revelation. Okay, it's been given to him, but he hasn't taken possession of it currently where we stand right now. And Revelation is about him taking possession of what is his. And it's also from him. It comes from Jesus Christ. It is Jesus. God gives Jesus the revelation. Jesus gives John the revelation through the help of an angel, as we'll find in the book. There are 35 names and titles of Jesus in Revelation. Revelation has the highest Christology of any book in the entire Bible. And what I mean by Christology, in other words, it exhorts and it puts Christ on a divine level more than any other book in the New Testament or Old Testament. If you read Revelation 1:1, it says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants, right? John was a servant. We are his servants. So it's from Jesus to us. Dr. Thomas Ice wrote this. First of all, I believe that the book of Revelation is a grand central station into which all future Bible prophecy flows. Yes, every other prophetic utterance that's written down in the Bible finds its culmination, finds its end, finds its fulfillment in Revelation. So by the time you have read the entire Bible from cover to cover, Genesis to Revelation, by the time you finish in Revelation, there's no unanswered questions yet that haven't already been raised throughout the rest of the Bible. Now, you might be able to come up with some, like, can God create a rock big enough he can't lift it? Okay, that's just silly, all right? But what I mean, there's no threads that are opened up that aren't solved as far as anything the Bible will introduce. There are 278 allusions to the Old Testament in Revelation. And allusions means it's a reference back, but not a quote. Because here's the thing you need to understand. There are no direct quotes from the Old Testament in Revelation. I am currently going through a series by an Old Testament scholar where he's going through the book of Revelation, but not to discuss the book of Revelation. He's going through it basically trying to make sense of the Old Testament indirect quotes and try to shed light on it and so forth. It's rather fascinating, but no direct quotes. Revelation is the only prophetic book in the New Testament. In other words, it's the only book in the New Testament that is fully devoted to prophecy. You can see prophecy in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You can see a little bit of it here and there in an indirect way in Acts. And then you can see Paul reference some things like in 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians. But Revelation is the only book fully devoted to it. It gives the proper view, which is God's view of history. Right? In our culture today, there is a lot of talk about how history should be taught. Should we only teach black history from a black perspective, or from a transgender perspective, or a white perspective, or an American perspective, or should we not teach American history? I'm going to tell you, it doesn't matter. What really matters from a historical perspective is what is God's view on history. And the only place you're going to find God's view of history is in the scriptures, in the Bible. And Revelation ties all that together in a lot of ways. If you think about it, Genesis starts in a garden, right, with humanity, with rivers and a tree of life. Did you know Revelation ends the exact same way? And so it's about, it's a capstone on everything. It's God's view of human history for us. Our view can change and will change, and history books will be rewritten, but God's view never changes on history. Some other highlights. It has the highest Christology in the New Testament. I already mentioned that. It has an elaborate doctrine of Satan, demons, and the Antichrist, right? Those of you who took angelology with me last fall, we spent a lot of time in Revelation, especially chapter 12, right? Talking about Satan and fallen angels and the war in heaven and so forth. And we will do that again in this class when we get to chapter 12. It predicts a final one-world urban system, okay? So, and it really does. It talks about a one-world global system. So sometimes people ask me, Chris, how do you vote? Well, I have two things I vote on. One, I won't vote for a baby killer who will advance that, and I won't vote for somebody who's for globalism, because globalism is against God. And I can make the case to you all the way from Genesis all the way to the end of Revelation that globalism is against God. It's a one-world system that is anti-Christ, anti-God. And so anybody who would try to advance a global system, unless I'm feeling kind of, devil's advocate and want to say, let's usher in the end times, I don't vote that way. So you do your own conscience. Revelation literally means apocalypse, which means to cause something to be fully known, to reveal, to disclose, to make fully known, or to reveal, revelation. That's where we get our English word for it, but it literally means apocalypse. So when will the apocalypse happen? That's a very correct way of saying it. You're asking, when will the events in Revelation 4 and onwards unfold in human history? Revelation 1:3, blessed is he who reads, and those who hear the words of the prophecy, and heed the things which are written in it, for the time is near. Revelation calls itself prophecy. It does it again in 22:10. And he said to me, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near. What is prophecy? Prophecy is always something that is being told that you would have no ability to know otherwise. So it either reveals something that you'd have no ability to know that is happening currently, or it is something that is happening in the future, so you have no way of knowing it. So think about this. Those of you who are somewhat familiar with Revelation, you'll understand this. If you're not familiar with it at all, this might fall on deaf ears until later on. Revelation 2 and 3 is prophecy because Jesus is talking about things that are happening in various churches in Asia Minor that John, who is receiving this revelation, and nobody else would know, because it's not like you just got on Twitter and Facebook and found out what was happening at those churches back then, okay? It basically was a fulfillment of prophecy right then and there to authenticate the book. So when those churches got that, they're like, oh, how did he know that type thing? And then from the other perspective is 4 and onwards is talking about things that will happen in the future. Todd, you had a question?
No, I'm seeing Fred.
Oh. That's all right. So, the form of the book of Revelation is a prophecy, but it's written in an epistle form. In other words, an epistle basically is kind of like a letter that they're writing, right? There's letters being written to 7 churches in chapters 2 through 3, as we'll see. But it contains apocalyptic end-time prophecy and imagery. And those images, those symbols, can be known to figure out what they are in most cases. Okay. Everyone doing good? That was a lot of info. I know. There's a lot of introductory stuff this morning. So, the word "and" is contained 1,200 times in this book. It's the Greek word "kai." There's actually a whole, basically, understanding of what this is called, and it's called kai meter. The idea is, you ever have like a little kid come up to you and tell you a story, and they go, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened? It's very similar to that. The Apostle John is just writing these things down. He's like, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And you're just like, whoa, slow down, buddy. I'm trying to soak it all in. It does feel like that at times, trying to drink from a higher fire hydrant. The word great or megos is in there 82 times. The frequency of 7 is in there 54 times. So sometimes you'll hear about people talk about Bible prophecy, 7 being a significant number. And it is in some ways, maybe not quite to the extreme, some will take it. And then throne is in there 46 times. Okay? Throne is always considered a seat of power, whether it be for God or for somebody else. So how do we outline the book? Well, chapter 1, the theme is all about Christ. It really kind of elevates him and talks about who he is and what he's done for us as Christians. 2 through 3 is all dealing with the church. Okay? And a weird thing that is after chapter 3, the church is never mentioned again in Revelation. Okay? And then 4 through 22 oftentimes is called the consummation. In other words, it's the bringing together of all ends. It's the consummation of Jesus Christ taking his kingship. Okay? Sometimes people will call just end-time study just consummation of all things, and that's a very appropriate way to do that. If you wanted to find a key verse in Revelation, here is your key verse. Revelation 1:7, behold, he, meaning Christ, is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will wail on account of him, even so, amen. So, a couple things to note here. This is a recurring theme in Scripture, that when he comes in the clouds, everybody will see him. Many have speculated to say what will happen is he will come down and he will stay there for 24 hours and let the earth do a complete rotation, and people will just be awestruck looking at him at that time. Okay? And here's the other thing. People will not be happy to see him. Because look, it says, and all the tribes of the earth will wail. They'll mourn on account of him. Well, why? Is because when he comes back at the end of Revelation, the world is not in a good place. There is a global war. There is people who are angry and hating God and shaking their fists. And there are not many who are happy to see him. It is not a happy time for the people who live on earth. The theme, if you want a theme for the book, it's the ultimate triumph of Jesus Christ. Isn't that what we're looking for? We're living our lives right now, and oftentimes there's many of us who are saying, God, why? Why is this happening? Why is this happening in the world? Why are we seeing this? Why did somebody get sick? Why did somebody die? Why is COVID-19 happening? Why are there wars? Why? Well, Revelation is the triumph of Jesus Christ. Everything that he has promised to fulfill is fulfilled by the end of Revelation. He is righting every wrong. at that point. He is bringing judgment on all those who have sinned against him and have not put their faith and trust in him for the forgiveness of sin. It's the ultimate triumph of Jesus Christ. Okay, so here's some background. It's being written to 7 churches in Asia Minor. There is things going on outside the church. Outside the churches, there is local intermittent persecution. Okay, I don't mean people are saying bad things about them and hurting their feelings. Okay, it's not American persecution. Okay, this is real persecution where intermittently it's happening at a local level, and what happens is they'll just round up people who are going to churches. It's very much like what's happening in China if you follow that at all. Okay. And then inside the churches, there's a lot of apathy where people just don't care. There's a lot of apostasy where people are falling away from good doctrine. And you'll see that when we start reading about what Jesus has to say to these 7 churches. Domitian is more than likely the emperor at the time. Titus Flavius Caesar Domitius Augustus, how's that for a title, right? Was Roman emperor from 81 to 96 AD. Domitian was the 3rd and last emperor of the Flavian dynasty. This is important because we're going to see why here in the next session while we're going through this. But he had a temple raised to him in Ephesus. And Ephesus, Turkey, is Asia Minor, where these 7 churches are located that they're being written to. He had a big temple there made to him. He had all the coins stamped with his likeness on them. He had an altar placed around the Roman emperor where people would have to go and offer sacrifices to him. And then he made a giant colossus or giant statue inside his temple. I think he's either there's been some degradation over time or he was not a very attractive individual. And so the colossus obviously had the rest of the body, but that's what we have. It's still recognizable to this day. So... yeah, and so just if you want a size comparison, that is an average human adult standing next to just the head. So this is a big statue. When I say colossus, I mean a colossal statue type thing. A purpose statement. Okay, oftentimes a purpose statement helps us when we're studying a book. What is the purpose of this book? Why was it written? It helps us stay on track and not wander off in our own direction. So here's a purpose statement for us for Revelation. It's to give believers the advanced history of how Jesus Christ, through judgment, becomes king, with a view towards calling the entire world to faithfulness and to godliness. Okay, that's the goal. Judgment, because if you read in the Old Testament, how many are familiar with the term, the great and terrible day of the Lord? Anyone ever familiar with that? That is what happens in Revelation, the day of the Lord happens. Christ becomes king because he replaces all of the rulers on earth by the end of it, and he is the one king where all nations are coming and bringing tribute to him. And this will help us. Some say, hey, sometimes Revelation is not very relevant. Well, it should be relevant to us. I know as I read Revelation, and I'm reading this, it fills me with hope, even though there's a lot of sadness and destruction in it, but it fills me for hope that Christ isn't going to just allow this world to continue in this chaos. He's eventually going to do something and fix it. And then it helps call me to godliness and faithfulness because I realize, yeah, this is reality. This is going to happen. This is the future. It could be tomorrow. We may not finish this class and these things start to happen, right? It could happen at any moment. And so it is very relevant to us. 1 John 3:3, so John's the writer of 1 John and obviously Revelation. He says, and everyone who has this hope, in other words, this hope that Christ is coming back, fixed on him, purifies himself just as he is pure. If our hope really is fixed on Christ, it should lead to a godly, purified life as we try to live that out. Doesn't mean we don't hit roadblocks and sin. It just means we're striving towards holiness. Okay. Doing okay on time here. 2 patterns that aid our understanding. Okay. What I hear all the time from Christians is Revelation is so difficult to understand. I don't know what's going on. It's constantly jumping around. Sometimes it's in heaven, sometimes it's on earth. How am I supposed to make sense of any of this? Well, let's talk about why that happens. There are alternating perspectives being shown in the book. Chapters 1 through 3 is all taking place on earth, and it's all actually taking place in the past in a lot of ways. It's Christ appearing to John. John is writing these things down. Letters are being sent to these 7 churches. Chapters 4 through 5 changes places and starts to look at a future event. It's in heaven. It's who is worthy to take the scroll. And I saw one like a lamb who was slain, who picked up the scroll, and he received all glory and honor and power, and holy, holy, holy is his name, type thing. And then chapter 6 is back on earth. And so and this is the pattern. It goes heaven and earth, back and forth. It's alternating that pacing. Chapter 6 is dealing with the seal judgments. 7 through 8 are trumpet judgments. And then chapter 16 are these bowl judgments, okay? And what you're seeing here happening is there's this back and forth. There's action taking place on earth, and then there's what's called an interlude. And what you're seeing is it's back in heaven, and there's being commentary given on what's happening in heaven, kind of explaining it from God's perspective, and sometimes even giving hints of what's going to happen in the next round that takes place on earth. So it's almost like a, if you ever watched maybe like a TV show or read a book where sometimes they do this, there'll be these events that are taking place, and then all of a sudden it changes direction, and you maybe have some people talking about the events, commentaries. It's very much like that. So don't worry. If that's a little confusing right now, we'll talk about it more as we walk through those things. Here's a timeline for you. Chapter 6 is the seals. Chapter 7 is your first interlude. Then you have the trumpets, okay? Or as I like to say, since Trump was acquitted yesterday, that means we have 6 more Trumps coming. After the last one. Whew. All right, sorry. Then after the trumpets, you have a second interlude that lasts for a very long time. Because there's a lot of things happening. And that's where people really get thrown off. They're like it's building to something. All the Bible talks about this last trump happening, and then Christ comes back, and then, whoa, what happens? And then we have this huge, long interlude. And it's heaven's perspective on events that are taking place on earth. Then we come back, and that 7 trumpet actually opened what's called the 7 bowl judgments. And then you finally have the return of Christ. So you see this where it's alternating back and forth. You have seals, the bottom half is earth, and the top half of that chart is what's taking place in heaven, where the return of Christ it starts in heaven and then comes down to earth. So, fun stuff. Yeah, by the way, the return of Christ are some of my favorite chapters in Scripture. When we get to that, you'll see me really light up. I love talking about the last 4 or 5 chapters of Revelation. Revelation 1:19, write therefore the things that you have seen, those that are, and those that are to take place after this. So we know a lot of the things are future events based on what Jesus tells John. Things that you have seen, those that are, so things that are taking place now, that's to those 7 churches, and then things that are to take place after that are the future events. So as we kind of look at this, you can kind of divide Revelation into those 3 areas. Chapter 1 being about Christ, 2 and 3 is about the church, and 4 through 22 is about the return of Christ ultimately. So as we start back up, I promise you, we will get into the text starting next week more heavily. But Revelation is such a front-loaded book, and people have had so many different perspectives at looking at it over time that if we don't establish how we're going to read it, we won't all be on the same page. And that's what today is all about. So, as you can kind of see, session 2 is where we're at now. 4 views of the timing of the events in Revelation. Okay, and there have been 4 main views over time, and we have to pick one because if we try to do all 4, we're never going to finish this class. I'll just be honest. It's going to turn in from 27 sessions across 12 weeks into 27 years, right? I don't have time for that, okay? Some of you definitely don't have time for it. And many of you are saying, why does that even matter? The rapture's happening later this year, so. So Revelation session 2, we need to really attack how we're going to do this, because some read Revelation as history already taking place. Some read it as you can't make any sense of it, so you just kind of roll it into your day-to-day and try to apply it to yourself. And some see it as a future event. But we need to figure this out and kind of come to at least how we're going to attack it as a class. And I already know how we're going to attack it as a class, and some of you can probably guess because you kind of know my position on these things. But for some of you, it'll be a surprise, and you'll be upset with me because I'm not taking your view. Purpose statement, as I recall, from just a few moments ago, is to give believers an advanced history of how Jesus Christ, through judgment, becomes king with a view towards calling them the faithfulness and godliness. So by me saying this purpose, I've already tipped my hand a little bit on how we're going to look at this book. But here are some critical questions about timing that we really need to discuss as a class and come to grips with. So everybody agrees that chapter 1 is all about Christ. Okay, there's no disagreement about that. There's no like different camps within Christianity saying, oh, well, no, I think it's about this. It's obvious. There's consensus about it. There's also consensus about chapters 2 and 3 all being about the church. There's no questions about that either. It says, write this to the church in Smyrna, write this to the church in Laodicea, and so forth. Nobody questions that. This is where the discussion comes in. What do you do with all that? Just a small part of the book. No big deal, right? Yeah. So, Christians, they don't argue about anything. So, I don't see why this is a big deal. Okay? So this is what we're talking about right now in this session is chapters 4 through 22. How do you understand it and how do you read it on when it takes place? There are 4 views. Okay? There's the preterist, historicist, idealist, and futurist. Okay? And you're like, that's a lot of words. Ist? Yeah, you gotta get the ist. Yeah. So the 4 ists of Revelation, I don't know. So let's just go on. So there are 3 main questions you have to ask about Revelation before you kind of go into it. Because if you don't kind of answer where you kind of fall on this, and you just kind of say, hey, I just think all of them are good, you're just going to be all over the place, okay? And so before you set out to read it and study it, you really need to kind of pick your path, and then you can pick a different path and reread it again, but if you're all over the place, you're just going to kind of come out and say, this is a mess, I don't know what to believe. So the first question you have to ask yourself is it preterism, historicism, idealism, futurism, or there's actually another view that I would not suggest taking, which is eclecticism, which is basically you just take all 4 and mash them together. That's the indecisive view. But then there's the next question. These next 2 questions you'll be more familiar with, I promise. When does the millennium take place? Right? Now, some of you are a lot more familiar with that. Do you hold to amillennialism, post-millennialism, or pre-millennialism? So the millennium is that 1,000-year reign of Christ talked about at the end of Revelation. So an amillennialist says we're in the millennium. We're currently in it. Okay? Christ is reigning from heaven in our hearts. And so we're in the millennium. Post-millennium says the millennium already happened and we're after it. Boy, if we're after the millennium, I want out. Okay? And premillennium says no, the millennium hasn't taken place. That's a future event. It's going to take place sometime in the future when Christ comes back. It hasn't happened yet. The next question you have to ask is about the rapture. First thing you have to ask is there even a rapture? Okay? Because that's the first question you have to ask. And then if your answer is yes, there is a rapture, then you have to answer this question. Does it take place before the tribulation? Does it take place in the middle of the tribulation? Does it take place after the tribulation? Does it take place before the wrathful part of the tribulation takes place? Did I lose y'all? Yeah. So, and these are the different views that people take. Now, typically, only if you're premillennial do you even ask the question of whether there's a rapture or not. Okay? And then if you say yes, then you would have to ask, when does that rapture take place? So, if you are a member of High Point Church, I'm going to make this really easy for you. I'm going to tell you what you believe. See? Or what you should believe, hint, hint, because you said you did when you signed it. This is from the HBC doctrinal statement. We believe in the blessed hope, the bodily, pre-millennial. In other words, we think at High Point Church, we believe the millennium is yet to happen. It is a future event. We are not in it. We are not past it. It is happening in the future. With the imminent return of the Lord Jesus Christ, we believe in the bodily resurrection of both the saved and the lost. The saved are raised to eternal conscious bliss in heaven. The lost are raised to eternal conscious torment in the lake of fire. So, what you will notice that we do not have in there is what? The rapture. We don't even allude to it as being a thing. The reason why is, if you believe there's a rapture or not, or when the timing takes place, really doesn't matter at all. I'm going to be honest with you. I mean, it just really, really doesn't. If you're a premillennial or amillennial, you'll read the entire New Testament completely different. You're not even on the same page. That's why we make it a test of fellowship to be a member of High Point Church. Okay? There really is a big difference. Although, as what I found when I listen to most preachers today in America, they don't know what they believe anyway, so it's a little bit of both all the time. Drives me nuts. That's when I'm in the car, I'm driving along, and I'm listening to the sermon, and I start yelling at my radio. Okay? It's also why I don't listen to K-Love or Life 107.1, because every time the radio people get on, I start yelling at them. That's heresy. Why are you saying that? Don't tell people that. Anyways, it's a fun car ride with me. That's why I just listen to podcasts. All right, 3 timing questions. Overall timing of Revelation, the timing of the millennium, and the timing of the rapture. Those are questions we all have to ask. Before we start reading, we're going to talk about the timing of Revelation. And then the timing of the millennium and the timing of rapture will kind of be just kind of played out as we discuss Revelation going forward from the coming weeks. Our very first one is Preterism. How many of you have heard of Preterism? No one's heard of Preterism? Wow.
Dave has. He just sent me.
Oh, is that what you're doing here? I thought maybe you were hitting Mary or something like that. So Preterism is really gained in popularity in the last 20 years. In fact, it's kind of crazy, yet it's almost nonsensical, as I'll kind of point out here in a little bit. But it's been raised to relevance because somebody really famous wholeheartedly believed in it, and that was R.C. Sproul. He taught Preterism. Now, before you're like, I want R.C. Sproul's view, he also taught baby baptism. Okay? So just be careful who you want to align with on that.
Old world too.
Huh?
Old world too.
Yeah, he also did not believe in literal 7 days of creation. So yeah, he would not be able to be a member of High Point Church for multiple reasons. Partial. There's a partial preterist. They believe that most, and a full preterist believe that all the events described in Revelation were fulfilled in the 1st century with the fall of the city of Jerusalem in AD 70. So a preterist would basically say, hey, if you're most, you would say usually right up to about Revelation 19, 20, right through there, all took place and was fulfilled by AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. A full preterist says, no, there's nothing left to be fulfilled. There is no future Bible prophecy whatsoever at all. That's depressing to me. If this is all we got, then I'm really depressed. So then maybe we should start taking care of the environment. Maybe we should build a spaceship to get off this planet because we're going to destroy it before too long with something. I don't believe in global warming per se, but I'm just saying, there might be something to it if you're a preterist. Anyways, there's full preterism, which is sometimes known as hyper, extreme, orthodox, or consistent preterism. The second coming has already happened. Okay? Ooh, so depressing. The resurrection of dead believers has already taken place. Oh. We're currently living in the new heaven and new earth. Oh!
Oh boy.
Now you hear why I say we should probably take better care of it, right? If there is an end to history, it isn't revealed in the Bible. Okay? So many say, hey, Revelation is the end of human history as we know it, because it starts a new history, essentially. Yeah, that's full preterism. So I'm going to come right out and tell you, full preterism is heresy. I mean, it's the very definition of heresy. Because there are 4 pillars of an Orthodox eschatology. In other words, all Christians over all time have believed these 4 things, regardless of all the other views you might have. The return of Jesus, full preterism, nope. Future bodily resurrection, full preterism, nope. Final judgment, nope, not for full preterism. And literal heaven and hell, well, not really for full preterism, because they're saying the new heaven, we're currently in it, and I want my money back. So that's full preterism. Most people are partial preterists, though, but I wanted to bring that up just in case you've ever heard of that or hear someone say it, and now you're familiar with it. It is actually fairly popular in some certain circles. Partial preterism would be R.C. Sproul's view. I'm not calling him a heretic. You can pass the orthodoxy test with this one. It says the tribulation period and the majority of biblical prophecies were fulfilled in the events surrounding 70 AD. They would oftentimes see the return of Christ. The return of Christ is still a future event, but everything else besides that up to that point in Revelation actually was fulfilled in AD 70. So you ever see those people walking around holding the signs the world's going to end? Well, this would be a preterist. Relax, it all happened in 70 AD. Essentially, right? The only thing you need to be looking for is the return of Christ. Then there's final judgment, though, in the partial preterist view. But all these nasty, terrible things where it says 1/3 of humanity was destroyed, and half of humanity was dead, and the water turned to blood, and the sun was blocked out, and the rocks were falling, and so forth. That all took place in AD 70.
Where do they get the historical to do that? Because shouldn't history show that most of the sea turned red and all that?
Yeah, well, it's all symbolism. So you just kind of look at that history back then, open up the Roman history books, and then open up Revelation and say, well, that symbolizes this, and you just kind of...
So symbolism rather than literal.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it never does add up quite perfectly. You're right. There are things where they just well, we don't really know, but it must have happened, we just didn't record it in history. You'll hear them say that sometimes, too. 6 reasons for preterism's growing in popularity. Well, a lack of consistent literal interpretation when it comes to reading our Bibles, okay? You take that away, and there's a whole smattering of Christians out there that say, oh, no, when you come to Revelation, you can't read it like you read the rest of your Bible. You have to read it as apocalyptic literature, which means you have to have a whole new set of standards you apply to the text when you read it. And that just confuses people to all get out, and they're just like, hey, I like the preterism view. Let's say it all took place, so I don't have to worry about it. Futurists' failure to understand their own system. As I kind of mentioned earlier, there's a lot. If you're premillennial, you're a futurist. Typically, well, you have to be, right? Because you're saying it's all a future event. Well, futurists often, because they don't really understand end time stuff, can be very difficult at times. They will preach or teach or read their Bible and just kind of pick from all these different viewpoints, and then it just starts to all fall apart, and it gets confusing, and you're like, hey, let's just say it all happened so I don't have to think about it, right? That's kind of, for a lot of, I'm not saying the scholars, but I'm saying for the average Christian sitting in a pew, it oftentimes becomes, this is an easy way to understand Revelation with partial preterism. It's the attraction of the anti-status quo. Any of you out there rebel rousers? You're just like, oh, I just want to take the opposing view just to start an argument. Sometimes people do that. There are some very articulate, influential promoters, R.C. Sproul being one of them, right? Sensationalism, date setting, and false predictions. I don't know about you, but the Harold Camping thing and all these other people who are going to say that in the world's this date and it's this date and the church says it's going to be here, I have zero tolerance for it, and it just irritates me to no end. And I think a lot of Christians get there and they're just like, okay, you know what? Maybe these are all false predictions because there's nothing to predict. It already happened. And so people just kind of fall into preterism. Timing statements and reader relevance. Oftentimes people say, hey, if it's all in the future, this isn't relevant to me. Think about it from this perspective. If you're a left behinder and you say, well, you know what? The church is going to be raptured out before it all happens anyways. This isn't relevant. I don't care, right? And there's some people take that standpoint. Revelation 1:1, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. And then also, blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near. Okay, so a partial preterist will say, hey, Revelation had to have been written in about 65 AD is what they say. And so therefore, if these events are going to take place soon or near, well, then it had to have been fulfilled in AD 70. That was the last major biblical event that took place. Now think about it. Some of Jesus' own prophecy was about the destruction of the temple, was it not? Mm-hmm. He says, he talks about, he alludes to it in different places. At one point, he kind of compares the temple to his body, but in other places, he says, hey, I guarantee you, there will not be a stone that will be on top of each other in the future. And well, they say, hey, look, there's a good timing, how to time it. It's all in AD 70 when all these things took place. But in order to do that, you do have to say Revelation was written in 65 AD, which is contrary to 99% of other Christians in history that says it was written in 95 AD. So you do have to make that adjustment. Isaiah 7:14, though, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Immanuel. Anyone know what year that was written, approximately? 600-700 AD, right in that time period? That's 600-700 years before the birth of Christ, right? So prophecy is not always immediately fulfilled. There can be lengths of time before it will be. So just something to think about there. The historicist view. The events of Revelation are being fulfilled in the present. It's currently happening. And are a panorama of the church history from the time of the apostles to the second coming of Christ. So if you go back and you like to read the reformers, Martin Luther and various other people, his compatriots, they often talked about Revelation using the historicist view, saying it was a panorama of what's happening to the church. So a lot of people like this because it's relevant. So this is how you do it. You open up Revelation, you look what's happening in your world and current events, and then you say, oh, that must be this. The reformers oftentimes would say, look, the Pope is the Antichrist. The Pope is the false beast. The great whore of Babylon is Rome and stuff like that. And so you take all these current events and you just kind of shoehorn it in there. Well, can you imagine the problem with that, though? We've had 2,000 years now. So what happened in the 1600s with the reformers is not the same as today. But how many people do you hear on televangelists on the radio and on TV who do this very thing? Oh, well, this happened in Russia today, and they signed this thing with Ukraine, and this is a fulfillment of Revelation, whatever, something like that. It's a very popular way of doing that. But it starts to fall apart when you kind of look at the last 2,000 years of history, because whose current events do you plug into that? Well, the historicists, oftentimes, people who commit to that say it doesn't matter, because it's not meant to be real events. It's just meant to kind of be a way to kind of view your world as these symbolic things that are taking place. The idealist view. The book of Revelation is timeless. Idealists believe that Revelation depicts a battle between the church and the world at all times in church history. So it's not any particular event, but you can kind of see this battle between the world and the church taking place, and then you can kind of, whatever's happening in your situation, in your part of the world, in your time, you can kind of go find something that's similar in Revelation and say, see, this is like that battle. This is like that war in heaven between Michael the archangel and Satan, the great dragon in Revelation 12. They do things like that. So to kind of recap, preterists, past, historicists are present, idealists are present, and then you kind of have, a futurists are in the future. But here is something to consider. In Revelation 1:13, and in the middle of the lampstands, I saw one like the Son of Man. In his right hand, he held 7 stars. So this is in chapter 1, we start getting introduced to this symbolic language. This is very important and very key Because Jesus is now using symbolic language, but you know what he's going to do? He's going to explain the symbolic language, saying that it actually does mean something that's literal and real. Because in Revelation 20, he concludes his thoughts and says, "And as for the mystery of the 7 stars, which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches." So he's basically saying the symbolic language does actually mean something specific. Now then you still have to ask, well, who are the 7 angels? Are they people, or are they actual angelic beings? Well, that's for a future class. The futurist view is Revelation 4 through 22 describes real people and events who are yet to appear on the world scene at the end of history. It hasn't taken place. It is not currently happening. And and as we kind of get into those chapters, I can say that with a certain amount of confidence if you take a futurist perspective, because you can clearly say these things have not happened. So I've kind of pointed out the weaknesses of the other views, but here's the weaknesses of futurism. There's no immediate fulfillment. So if you take Jesus' words, and it's Revelation, in Revelation 1, 2, and 3 there, and you realize it's AD 95, well, we've gone on nearly 2,000 years now, and these things haven't happened. And so many would say, hey, this is why this is not a futurist view. It's an idealist or a historicist or a preterist view, because you're looking for something that's not going to happen. Stop looking. It's been 2,000 years. Give up. And lack of reader relevancy, and I already kind of addressed that a little bit. If it's all future events and it doesn't really even apply to the church, why even bother reading it as the church? And you know what? Let's be quite honest. How many sermons do you hear from Revelation? Hardly any. In fact, most of the time when you hear people preach Revelation, what do they preach? 1 through 3. And then it's like, well, what happened to the rest of the book? Well, we're going to do the 7 churches of Revelation. All right, we're all done with that sermon series. Let's move on, right? I once preached Revelation 20 and 21 at High Point. And people were shocked. They'd never heard anyone preach past Revelation chapter 3 before. So, if you want to hear that, I'm sure it's in the sermon archive somewhere. So those are some of the weaknesses. But there are some really good strengths that we need to be aware of. There's a concrete meaning for the symbols. It's not just whatever you want to apply to it and how you interpret it in the moment. Everything literally means something. There might be some things that we're not sure about, but that's okay, right? I imagine if you're living through it, those symbols will become very clear for somebody. The view of the early church. This is very important. The early church were futurists. They believed that Revelation was future events. I'll clearly demonstrate that here in a moment, but they did that. It wasn't until about 500 AD, when the church started going wonky and where we started getting Roman Catholicism from, that they started saying, no, it's not a future event. Okay? Revelation bookends Genesis. And I already mentioned that. I talked about the garden and the tree of life, starting in Genesis, ending in Revelation, new heaven, new earth, everything restored. So the questions we're asking here, at High Point Church, what we believe, and then where I'm taking the class. Okay, I'm laying it out, laying the cards out there so you know how we're going to approach things. We're going to take a futurist view on the timing of Revelation. We're going to see it as future events. We're going to be premillennial, because I don't want to be kicked out of the church for teaching something that's not. I jest. Maybe not. I don't know. And what we're going to do, we are going to pick a timing of the rapture, because that makes things more interesting, and we will go in great detail about the different options, but we're going to take a pre-tribulation rapture view. Okay? That'll make 50% of the class happy who's read Left Behind. Okay? Personally, if you want to know where I personally fall, not just because I have to teach it, I am a futurist, I am premillennial, and I don't really care about the rapture. So, although, to graduate from seminary, I did have to sign a thing saying I am pre-tribulational. So if anybody's listening to this later on who happened to be there for my, my stuff to graduate, yes, pre-tribulation rapture. Okay. Almost done with this session here. So, the way we're going to divide it up, chapters 1 through 3 is all about the church age. As I mentioned earlier, the church is not mentioned again in Revelation, not once. Tribulation age is chapter 4 through 19. And then you have the kingdom age in Revelation 20. And then you have the eternal age, eternity future, in 21 through 22. Okay? That's our outline for the book, if you're trying to place it that way. Session 3 of 27 of Revelation is titled Dating the Book of Revelation. Bet you never knew you could date a book of the Bible. Okay, sorry, my terrible jokes. When you go to seminary, you know that's really all you do is you tell bad jokes.
Well, luckily you're a better teacher than you are a comedian.
I appreciate that, thank you. Reminds me of my seminary days. So, jumping into this, when the book of Revelation was written is more important to interpretation of the book than any other book in the New Testament. You know, when you hear a pastor or you start a new Bible study and they talk about the dating of when the book happened, and you're just like, hey, I don't really care. You know, I mean, it's important, but it's not really, you know. With Revelation, it's like super important because of the question regarding preterism versus the other views. So as you may recall, the four views we looked at was preterist, everything took place in the past. Historicist is present. Idealist would say it's timeless because you're always reinterpreting it. And futurist is a future event. Well, if it took place in the past, the timing of the book is very important because the events are given to John as a future thing. I mean, no one's going to argue that. Even preterists would say, hey, when John receives this, it is seen as a future event happening. So you kind of have to then the importance of when the book was written becomes very important. Preterism is date dependent, but the other views are not. Preterism relies on having an early writing for this book. R.C. Sproul said this: if the book was written after AD 70, then its contents manifestly do not refer to events surrounding the fall of Jerusalem. So even R.C. Sproul, who's the most famous preterist, says if we can't prove that the book was written before AD 70, then our entire view should just be thrown out. Okay? Kenneth Gentry, another individual who holds to it, says this: if the late date of around AD 95 to 96, which is when the majority of Christianity believes it was written, is to be accepted, a wholly different situation would prevail. The events of the mid and late 60s of the first century would be absolutely excluded as possible fulfillments. Okay? It just can't happen. We know for a fact, because Roman historians and Jewish historians wrote it down very clearly, we know exactly when Jerusalem was sacked and the temple was destroyed was in AD 70. There's no question about that in any way, shape, or form. But when the book was written, it needs to be written before AD 70, and actually probably at least a couple years before that to be relevant. R.C. Sproul says the burden for preterists then is to demonstrate that Revelation was written before AD 70. Spoiler alert, they're not able to effectively, but we'll walk through why that is. The early date is called a Neuronic Date, not because it was written by somebody who was neuronic, but that is actually a Roman terminology. Nero was emperor at the time, so you say that's Neuronic time period, whereas Domitianic, that is a hard word to say for me for whatever reason, AD 95, because Domitian was the emperor at the time. That's all that has to do with. So if you ever hear somebody talking about Neuronic versus Domitianic, now you know what they're talking about. They're probably talking about preterism. Because, you know, that comes up in daily conversation. Two lines of evidence to date books in the New Testament. There's external and internal. External would be things that are outside the Bible. Internal are things that are inside the Bible. Early date arguments. Okay, so you're a preterist, you're arguing for that early date. This is how you're going to argue for it. One, there's no mention of the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, there's not. Okay, so that either means it's not on people's radar, but I would actually argue it is, because Jesus seems to allude to it when he's alive and kicking here on earth before his death. And Then number 2, the timing statements in Revelation 1 and 3 indicate a fulfillment in the near future. We looked at those verses in the last 2 sessions, right? It says these things will soon take place. Number 3, the number of the beast matches the numeric equivalent of Nero Caesar. See, it's not a vaccine, it's Nero. Just kidding. There's some issues with that, though, just so you're aware. They actually have to intentionally misspell his name to get that to happen. I know that sounds weird, but if you actually go back and you look at some of the history and the way it was written, sometimes they did intentionally misspell his name, even in history. So that's where they get that from.
Is he the one that were to believe that was the cause of Rome being burnt?
Yes, he's the one to blame it on the Christians. He's the emperor who had the Apostle Peter and Paul put to death.
Okay.
Yep. Revelation mentions the temple. Well, if the temple had already been destroyed, then why would they mention it? That's an interesting thing, simply because if you think about this, Ezekiel mentioned, and Daniel both mentioned a temple in their writings. Well, when they wrote, did you know that there was no temple? Well, at least Ezekiel, there was a temple at the beginning, but later on, there wasn't. But even after it's destroyed, he mentions another future temple. And his vision of the temple that he kind of lays out for people never matches the temple that was built in Jesus' day. Okay, they're different. And so Revelation mentioning a temple is not anything new that the Old Testament hasn't already done. Irenaeus, who lived from 120 to 202 AD. So here's an important thing before we read this that you need to realize. The Apostle John discipled a man by the name of Polycarp. If you read, I think, Fox's Book of Martyrs, Polycarp is very famous. When he was really old, like in his 90s, he was fed the lions before a Roman emperor. Polycarp discipled Irenaeus. I don't think I'm saying that right. Some of these names I just cannot say, so you're just going to have to forgive me on that. So this is what Irenaeus said, who was discipled by Polycarp, who was discipled by the Apostle John, who wrote Revelation. We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of Antichrist. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision. Think about that. Irenaeus is saying, we don't know who the Antichrist is in this present time. He wasn't born until 120. John's long dead. He's already written it. Whether you hold an early writing or a late writing, how come if these things already took place, how come Irenaeus cannot tell you who the Antichrist is? Okay? And then he says, it would have been announced by him who held the apocalyptic vision. Well, if John, we know for a fact John lived to late 90s, which he would have lived, if he had wrote it in 65, it all was fulfilled in 70, don't you think he would have spent the next 30 years talking about it in great detail? But he doesn't. For that was seen not very long ago, time since, but also in our day towards the end of Domitian's reign. And even then, he's referencing that John wrote this under whose reign? Domitian instead of Nero. Okay, we're all done. Let's go home for the day. I mean, this is where, this is one of those things that's just kind of like, in my mind, this just seals the discussion on it, okay? It's obviously could not have been written in 65 AD. There's all the evidence you need for a late 90s writing for it. Late date arguments, so we have the testimony of Irenaeus that we already saw, and it's the view of the early church, the rest of the early church also. Church fathers, Hegesippus, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Victorinus, Eusebius, and Jerome. Of those, maybe you've heard of Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria, but Eusebius is the father of church history for the first couple hundred years of the church. He wrote it. Jerome is known for translating the entire Bible into Latin, where you get the Latin Vulgate. But Roman Catholics use it. He was not Roman Catholic. They just took that from him. But he translated it into Latin. And so these are some, I mean, all these individuals have very clear writings and clear statements about the timing of all that. Okay? And there's other church fathers that do as well, just maybe not quite as clear. Internal evidence for a late date. John's reputation in Asia Minor grew too quickly. So, we know from church history that the Apostle John did not, very first time he ever would have arrived in Asia Minor, which is where the 7 churches are in Revelation, was about mid-60s. Okay, so by the mid-60s, between, let's say he got there in 64, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. By 70 AD, if everything was fulfilled, that is not a lot of time for the Apostle John to be there and for him to receive revelation and then to have that propagated for those 7 churches. And his popularity as well. We know that John was also a pastor in the church in Ephesus for a period of time and taught there at their quote-unquote like Bible college thing that they had. Oh,
Good question. So there was no external evidence for the early date? Because you didn't. There's nothing listed here, and I was just making sure I didn't miss it, or
we're basically refuting it, is what we're doing.
I know, but
yeah.
you didn't put anything down for the external, or he didn't. So.
It wasn't me.
I know. I mean, yes. So anything that was external wouldn't have been.
There's not a lot of evidence,
okay.
Unfortunately. Yeah. Basically, the arguments against it. So, if you were to have scales, so outweigh the positive stuff that it's not even a competition.
Okay. Well, no, I would just ask because I didn't see it. I want to make sure.
Robert Thomas said a Neuronic dating would hardly allow time for him to have settled in Asia, to have replaced Paul as the respected leader of the Asian churches, and then to have been exiled to Patmos before Nero's death in AD 68. Because remember, not only does he have to be a prominent leader in the Asia Minor churches, he has to be exiled to Patmos. That is not a long period of time for that to all take place. Late date arguments internal. John's reputation in Asia Minor grew too quickly. The church's spiritual decline was unusually fast. So think about this. 6 of the 7 churches, Jesus does not have very flattering things to say about them. Paul had planted most of those churches within the last 10 to 15 years in a lot of ways there. Or in the 50s anyways, at the very earliest. And so they grew into spiritual decline very, very quickly. But when you see Paul write to the church in Ephesus, he doesn't seem to have anything negative to say to them, right? In fact, it's very positive, very encouraging, and yeah, very theological. But you go look at the church in Corinth. He's not somebody who's afraid to really stick it to him, right? You think he would have done the same thing if their love had grown cold, as it says in Revelation. Well, but now you allow 30, 40 years for that church to exist, and yeah, then you start to see maybe those things did set in, and that's a lot more appropriate just from a common sense standpoint.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, for what?
That makes a lot of sense now. For what he says here.
Oh, okay, good. I'm glad. Yeah, I'm glad. See, some of these arguments resonate with people more than others. The church in Smyrna couldn't have existed long enough. It just, if you look at when it was founded and when people were there to found the church, it just could not have existed long enough to even be considered for that letter. We're not going to go into all those details because I got to cut some corners here to get through time. Polycarp, for he boasts of you all in those churches, which alone then knew the Lord. Oh, we will do this though. But we of Smyrna had not yet known him. So Polycarp was basically saying at Smyrna they did not know of John at the time of writing, is what that's referencing. Late date arguments. Internal, next, the earthquake near Laodicea should have humbled them. So Colossae in Laodicea is one of the churches in Revelation. They suffered a great earthquake that totally destroyed Colossae and Laodicea on a very devastating standpoint. And it should have humbled them, right? Like, can you imagine, like, in Altoona, if we had an earthquake and all our buildings were almost completely leveled and we had to rebuild? Don't you think we'd be a little bit more humble in things? Well, this is what John wrote to the church in Smyrna. So because you are lukewarm and Laodicea, not Smyrna, and neither not hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth, because you say, I am rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing. And you do not know that you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. So in other words, the idea is you would think that if this earthquake had just happened, and it took 30 years to rebuild Laodicea, by the way, we know that from Roman history, they would be at the very beginning of this cycle of rebuilding if the book was written in 65 AD. This does not sound like something you write to a people who are absolutely just devastated and destroyed at that time. But you get 30 years from the 60s when the earthquake happened, and 95, they're completely rebuilt. They're a very rich and wealthy place. It starts to make a lot more sense. Colin Hemmer says, Maggie seems to infer that Rome was unwilling to help and that inhabitants were forced to rebuild the city at their own expense. I think this is less likely than the Laodiceans refused the offer. This is the implication of Tacitus's wording and that most natural reading of the case. Those are our preterists who come back and say, hey, they had so much money, they did not need help to rebuild. And so what Jesus is actually referring to there when he addresses the church in Laodicea is that they have so much money, they don't need help rebuilding. That could be. It's a possibility. But Colin Hemmer, a historian, says, I think this is less likely that the Laodiceans refused the offer. Basically, people argue about this. You're trying to read Roman documents from 2,000 years ago and try to make sense of this whole political thing between Rome and Laodicea. Rome would often do the same thing the American government does, right? You have a natural disaster. America comes in and says, here, take all this money. We'll send FEMA in and we'll help you rebuild. Rome would do the very same thing with a lot of cities at the same time. I don't know. Still a small argument to make. John's banishment to Patmos was unusual for Nero. So we see that John was on Patmos from Revelation 1:9. He was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. Nero was not known for banishing anybody. He just killed people. In fact, he was kind of a sociopath in some ways. Some will describe him. He killed the Apostle John, he killed the Apostle Peter, and many, many other Christians. We already talked about burning Rome, blaming it on the Christians. Domitian, on the other hand, though, he was a lot more level-headed, and he would oftentimes banish people, which lines up a whole lot more with his reign at the time. Kim Riddlebarger, okay, he is a very well-known amillennialist, okay, so he would not believe what we believe, but he even joins in and argues against preterism. And Kim Riddlebarger said this, in order to prove that the Lord returned in AD 70, preterists must prove that Revelation was written prior to AD 70. Therefore, having already made a determination about the date of the Lord's return, an argument has been constructed to argue for a pre-AD 70 date for the writing of Revelation. He continues on. One wonders if preterist arguments for an early date are based more upon theological necessity than on aggregate of the internal and external evidence. In other words, he's accusing preterists of doing what a lot of us do at times, where we have a theological argument that we really like, and then we go find ways to support our view, right? We've all done it. It happens. And so preterism seems to be in line with that in a lot of ways. I'm sorry, R.C. Sproul fans, okay? Great man, and he does a lot of great teachings. I'm not trying to badmouth him, but this is one of his views that just maybe just didn't quite line up all that well. Okay. We have a minute or two. That was our last slide. We made it. Next week we slow down. We're going to do 2 sessions at a time. We'll have more class discussion. But I want to raise it for any questions anybody might have in our last minute or two.
Where's Asia Minor?
Asia Minor is in modern-day Turkey. So it'd be just north of Israel and just south of, sitting in Russia and some of those Eastern European countries. Yeah. Todd, did you have one over there?
Yeah, and I think it's just kind of my simple thinking, but when you have the arguments that are so, quite frankly, obvious when you just look at dates, how do they even get airtime? I mean, why are we discussing it?
Well, let me ask you this, Todd. Is the Earth flat?
Is the Earth flat? Well, some people think it's a disk, but no, it's round.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sometimes people just believe what they want to believe.
But we're giving them airtime. So it's almost like I don't want to say buying into it, but we're giving them credibility.
Yeah. Preterism is you'll run into that a lot. So if you pick up any kind of modern books dealing with end times, they'll spend a lot of time on it. If you spend any time going through Twitter or Reddit or theological circles, and look up things, if you just start doing Google search of end times, Revelation, you'll run into it. And that's why I'm giving airtime to it, because sometimes the best way to kind of know what you're dealing with is seeing it for what it is. Yeah. So it's just I was surprised when nobody had heard of preterism in this class. So yeah, maybe we did spend too much time on it, but it's a big deal. Yeah. Yeah.
Are there any denominations that subscribe to preterism?
No, not really. Not a whole denomination that would say that's our view. No. It's too new. It's only within the last 20 years or so. And so I don't know of anybody who's adopted it as an official statement of faith. So seminaries, there's some seminaries that have. So you can go to a certain Bible college or seminaries and they'll teach it as that being reality. That's different than a church. But that's usually how things change. If you can get a seminary that change a doctrinal position, they train a bunch of pastors and even people who will be lay people in the church eventually one day. Yeah. And then it gets out into the church, and then all of a sudden they want to change everything because that's what they've been taught. Right. In fact, that's actually why you see the church usually drift away from doctrinal truth. It's a good question. All right, I'll close in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for our time today. It's Revelation is a loaded book, Lord, and we need wisdom as we go through this. We need understanding. We need your guidance. I pray that as we really dive into the text starting next week, that this will be a blessing to us. It'll be an encouragement. It'll point us to that blessed hope that we have in you, that we'd find it relevant for our lives and realize, hey, we know how it all ends, and therefore it encourages us to continue to put our faith in you. And I pray in Jesus' name, amen.